Good morning. It is Thursday, June the 6th, and this is The Drill. Thank you very much. My name is Ronald T. Hardgrove. This is my podcast called The Drill, and The Drill is about being a true conservative versus being a reactionary. It's about what true conservatism is and why it matters. My podcast is made possible by Spreaker.com. My email address is storytimes@hotmail.com. I'm on Twitter at Ronald Hardgrove and on Facebook at The Drill. You're not a Trump supporter, are you? You're not a conservative, are you? So you believe that anyone who questions President Obama's nationality isn't racist? How you deal with these questions determines whether or not you are a true conservative. What is a true conservative? I'll give you an example. The left is always creating movements towards socialist paradise. A reactionary is dogmatic and defiant of those movements and seeks to create counter-movements. A true conservative is open-minded, but unmoved, unless there's a good reason to be moved. Being truly conservative is also about integrity. Maintaining your integrity is about listening carefully, reading carefully, and about consistency. It's about not getting tricked, about responding and not reacting. Integrity is also about how you live, not just how you vote. True conservative is not merely a political identity, but a philosophical reality. True conservatism is fundamentally about being realistic, and being realistic is fundamentally about making the presumption for the status quo. What does it mean to presume the status quo? It means that we recognize the benevolence of the universe and the expectation of success. We make the presumption for the United States of America and all of its institutions, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and trifurcated government. We do not try to turn the United States into another country, either real or imagined. We make the presumption for the evidence of our senses. So that's the introduction to my show, and I'm going to take a little break, and when I come back, when the waters were changed. Thank you very much. Welcome back. From the book called, it's Tales of the Dervishes. And this is a chapter called When the Waters Were Changed. Once upon a time, Qadir, teacher of Moses, called upon mankind with a warning. At a certain date, he said, all the water in the world which had not been specially hoarded would disappear. It would then be renewed with different water, which would drive men mad. Only one man listened to the meaning of this advice. He collected water and went to a secure place where he stored it and waited for the water to change its character. On the appointed date, the stream stopped running, the wells went dry, and the man who had listened, seeing this happening, went to his retreat and drank his preserved water. When he saw from his security the waterfalls again beginning to flow, the man descended among the other sons of men. He found that they were thinking and talking in an entirely different way from before. Yet they had no memory of what had happened, nor of having been warned. When he tried to talk to them, he realized that they thought he was mad, and they showed hostility or compassion, not understanding. At first, he drank none of the new water, but went back to his concealment to draw on his supplies every day. Finally, however, he took the decision to drink the new water because he could not bear the loneliness of living, behaving, and thinking in a different way from everyone else. He drank the new water and became like the rest. Then he forgot all about his own store of special water, and his fellows began to look upon him as a madman who had been miraculously restored to sanity. So that's basically the struggle we've got going in the United States today. there's a lot of parts of this book or this story that I recognize, talking and thinking in completely different ways. And the idea that when you try to communicate with those people, that's the left, then they either treat you with hostility or compassion. They treat you as though you're cuckoo. And so the issue here becomes, are you willing, how dedicated are you to reality, to the truth? Which is more important to you, popularity or the truth? And eventually, like the story says, this individual got to the point where he could no longer bear the loneliness of being right all the time. He was right, but he was lonely. And so he decided it was better to be wrong and popular than right and lonely. Now, if you look at this sole individual in here that was right as being a conservative and everyone else as being liberals, then it paints kind of a bleak picture for conservatives in this country. But actually, the reality is that the roles are somewhat reversed in that, yes, he is, or the outcome of this is different. That the way it's going to, I predict, go is that it will be the left that will end up being lonely and wrong and wanting to be both popular and right. So, and I think that's going to be the way it is, because you can't. There's a saying from a TV commercial: you can't fool Mother Nature, and you can't defy reality, at least not for long. So, I'll be back in a minute. Thank you very much. And now I'm going to be reading from the book called Soldier Dead. And I started it yesterday, and I'm in the second part of the introduction, where the author is describing basically how he got into got the idea of writing this book about how it is that the United States handles its war dead. And so this is the second part. I believe I was chosen to do this book. I didn't write it because it would be a good item on a resume, enrich me, or get my face before the public. I already had a great career in another field. Writing these words now, I know that it is no accident that led me to Forey's small trailer house that night 10 years ago. I had gone there for a reason entirely unrelated to his military duty, and his telling me the story was completely serendipitous. I did not begin work on this book at that time. Then, 7 years after Forey related to me the account of his duty in Korea, and in particular the recovery of the still unnamed hero, I woke in the middle of the night and found myself sitting bolt upright in bed. I had not been dreaming. Rather, my movement had dragged me from my slumber. The room was completely dark, yet before me in my mind's eye was a blazing vision of a single solitary soldier lying dead in a foxhole. His last moments, like those of how many others before and after him, must have been filled with more terror, anger, hope, and dread than most people will feel in a lifetime. And, I wondered, what about those who went back to find him? What did they think? What did they feel? Was their search for the missing the exception or the rule? At such moments when our minds are not bridled by the limits and habits of everyday waking consciousness, a desire and curiosity were planted in me that I knew would change me forever. The next day I began searching for an answer to the question, what happens to members of the armed forces when they die? When I asked my friends what they knew about those killed in service, they paused and said, quote, well, I'm not exactly sure. I haven't thought about it, unquote. We all had some vague recollection of Dover Air Force Base, a good image of a military funeral, complete with grieving widow accepting a folded flag. And most of us had visited the Tomb of the Unknowns at Arlington. We had some ideas about how the wounded were looked after, but next to nothing about what happens after the accounts in war movies and military history books end. Who, if anybody, looks after the dead? As I began my search for answers, I realized that I didn't even know what I didn't know. And not having been in the military, I was faced with learning the language and the structure of an organization I had only read about. In one of my first interviews with the director and deputy director of mortuary affairs in Fort Lee, Virginia, Tom Bourlier and Doug Howard, the public affairs officer, who was also present, asked if I had some more specific questions. I was embarrassed that I didn't know what else to ask, but I felt forces that operated with the strength of the tides motivating my search, and I trusted them to carry me where I needed to go. I was, to a certain extent, like people in times past who had no knowledge of the moon and its gravitational pull, yet observed and rode the rise and fall of the coastal waters. Slowly but steadily, I have discovered what happens to our military fallen, the extraordinary lengths to which we go to care for them, and why we do so, in much the same manner as scientists have learned to apply equations to the sublimely powerful pull between heavenly bodies. Finally, after trusting that the tide that had carried me would lift me up and leave me on a beach that held some measure of understanding, and after bouts of cynicism, doubt, incredulity, frustration, and exhaustion, highlighted by some important discoveries along the way, my view of the men and women in our armed services who live, who die, and who live to serve the dead has been radically altered. Examining the efforts made to retrieve and identify service persons who have died fighting for our country and freedoms has given me a new perspective on life. The sacrifices made by those who had given their lives and by those who attempt to bring them home and identify them dwarf such quotidian problems as burned bacon, stock market fluctuations, road construction, and flight delays. My search has taken me to parts of the world I had not visited before, carried me into the past, and afforded me a glimpse of the future. I've learned that soldier dead is a phrase that, before World War II, was used to refer collectively to military personnel in all branches who perished while in the armed forces. I've met simply wonderful individuals who opened doors for me without proof of any real experience or credentials beyond a burning desire. I can only imagine that in some little understood manner, their conviction connected with mine and prompted them to take extraordinary steps to help. I have read of and spoken with those who have risked and will risk their lives to recover the remains of their comrades, those who did and do hold their political careers to be more important than the duties of their office, and those who have fought and continue to fight for the rights of the dead and their families. Finally, I have learned what happens not just to American, but also to enemy soldier dead. Sadly, the story is not always so clean and pressed as the Guards' uniforms at Arlington. My search has been excruciatingly poignant and painful. At times, I've not known whether to rejoice or to cry. At one point, I developed a cynical attitude, wondering to what extent our devotion to the fallen was merely a societal contrivance. Conspiracy may be a better word, to guarantee a supply of young men and women who would, in blind loyalty, lay down their lives so we could assure ourselves an ample supply of petrochemicals. At another point, when telling my breakfast buddies how much money our government spent finding, identifying, and returning the remains of servicemen, we commented together, wisely so, over cups of coffee, that there had to be an end somewhere to the search for the fallen. And in those times when I shared my research and thoughts with friends of a more gentle persuasion, often the mother of a young man or woman, I observed the faraway look that came over the face of a parent envisioning, if for only a moment, the horror of losing a child and, even worse, not even having a body to grieve over and lay to rest. I was carried into military circles to the Pentagon, Dover Air Force Base, the U.S. Army Identification Lab in Hawaii, U.S. Army bases in Germany and Baghdad, Iraq. I spoke to people who played active roles in establishing military doctrine and setting policy, those who implemented them and those who stood guard, quote, on the walls, unquote, to preserve our way of life. I learned of the petty police that could hamper execution of a sacred duty. I came face to face with a knee-jerk defensive stance that I call a Penrosian attitude, explained in Chapter 5. the return of the dead. I spoke with those who volunteered for difficult assignments, knowing that there was no way they could please all of the people all of the time. And I heard stories from grieving families about how their needs were left unsatisfied and how they longed for some truth upon which to base a belief that their missing loved one was actually dead and not languishing in a prison somewhere across the world, believing himself forgotten. The support from my family was invaluable. Before going to Baghdad at a time when helicopters and planes were being hit by missiles, Humvees blown up, and civilian and military sites targeted by suicide bombers, I had a talk with my 2 sons and daughter and explained that this was something I had to do, and that even if the worst happened, what else could they wish for me to be doing other than continuing my quest? They were gravely concerned for my safety, but offered only support. At the Morgan Baghdad International Airport, where remains in that part of the country are prepared for the journey home, I spent time with an amazing group of men and women, and not just the mortuary workers. I saw 20-year-olds troop into barracks and halls, drop their battle gear, and fall instantly asleep, even in the most uncomfortable positions. This is nothing new. We've all seen the training films on the Discovery Channel and the History Channel where enlistees are driven to their physical and mental limits and beyond. But to see these men and women saddle up and go back out into the dark, cold, hostile night and never complain is something else again. It bears repeating. They never complain. They may grouse, just blowing off steam, but they get up and get the job done, knowing the dangers. After my safe return to the States, my children expressed how worried they'd been. In response, I said whatever sacrifice they and I had made would be infinitely small in the grand scheme of things, particularly compared to sacrifices involved in military duty, past, present, and future. If I didn't come home in a body bag, it was a good day, no matter what else might have happened. The issue of learning and speaking about the dead, especially those killed in military service, is extremely multifaceted. It can be a minefield in which you don't know where to step because the experiences of those involved are so emotional, the grief so palpable, and the desire to assuage grief so strong. Yet in this world, at least, practical considerations must be taken into account, the same as in welfare, medical care, and environmental concerns. While following press articles about how While following press articles about how the return of remains is no longer open to the media, I realized that the main point was being missed. The real debate was not about whether we should be allowed to view the dead upon arrival, but about how we, as a nation, note and commemorate the deaths of those killed in military service. When they come back in ones and twos, we are not able to avail ourselves, as a nation, of a funeral in the way that individual families do. We have an unsatisfied need to mourn. Our national commemoration, Memorial Day, has been hijacked, as have other holidays, not only by commercial interests, but also by our personal desire for time off and 3-day weekends. As have most issues regarding our soldier dead, this debate has come up before, although in somewhat different vein. Surprisingly, my search for information about American military fallen led me to the subject of enemy dead. Some may believe that the solution to the horns of a dilemma, achieving victory by using force without losing American lives, is to kill by remote control, where the enemy only registers as heat signatures on a display or becomes a set of coordinates punched into a computer at 30,000 feet. But it is here that I feel we need to take the next step. We must answer not only to our own dead, but also to those people we kill by whatever means, because the two are ultimately and intimately intertwined. What happens to those who die in military service is not a subject easily contemplated, much less discussed. For who wants to think of themselves or someone close to them as a disfigured pile of flesh on a cold metal table, or worse? Yet at times this is the result of military duty. My enthusiasm and what I have learned have made many uncomfortable. Restaurant patrons at adjoining tables have stared in horror as I recounted some particularly poignant story or discussed grisly details over dinner. And God only knows what some of my companions thought. Business meetings have been ended somewhat abruptly when conversation turned to my book. but many listeners have borne with me their wish to learn, overcoming their resistance or reluctance, and offered encouragement and assistance. As I acquired information about the processes and parties involved in the recovery, identification, and return of soldier dead, and began to understand the motivations of those who choose to work in this field, and those who, because of a death, are involuntarily and intimately caught up in the issue, I had to decide how to present this subject to the reader. This decision had three facets: organization, voice, and winnowing. First, I found that my account was clearest with the chapters organized by topic, and then by timeline within each chapter to show how the subject matter evolved. To present all the topics at once, strictly chronologically, would have been to focus on the wars themselves instead of soldier-dead issues. Second, I had to compartmentalize myself and create some space between my thoughts and feelings and the job I was doing, much like the surgeon preparing to penetrate a patient's brain with scalpel, rods, and fingers. Ultimately, this surgeon cannot help envisioning himself or one of his family members on a table undergoing a similar procedure, yet he must shift into his professional role to complete the procedure successfully. Only afterward can he drop his mask and relate to the patient and the patient's family. I have had to maintain a duality that is at times maddening, and that has at other times failed. I've striven to keep my observations, feelings, and emotions secondary to those clearly evident in the facts presented and in the voices recorded and documented here. Lastly, I've had to function as a big funnel through which facts, experiences, complaints, wishes, dreams, and nightmares have been narrowed down to the critical, essential elements. There is so much that I want to say, more than there is space available, in an attempt to take readers through some doors partially opened in the main text that is presented in a more formal manner. I conclude each chapter with an author's notes section in which I use my own voice. I hope these notes will provide additional insight and help to relate the text material to current events. Ultimately, this is not the book that many imagined and expected, but it aims to open and improve dialogue among the public, the media, the military, the government, and the United States and hostile forces. Bullets fly both ways, and if there is ever a unifying element among the people of the world, it is the grief experienced over the loss of a son or daughter, husband or wife, father or mother. The deeds and actions of the men and women who have died in service to our country, and those of their comrades who have served the dead, have touched us all, though perhaps we do not acknowledge it or even have any awareness of their efforts. This book presents a story that I have discovered belongs to all of us, that of Soldier Dead. And that concludes the introduction to the book called Soldier Dead. And next time I'm going to be reading from chapter 1, Why It Matters. So, back in a minute. All right, thank you very much. And now on to the Ayn Rand lexicon and the concept of the day. And today's concept is freedom. What is the basic, the essential, the crucial principle that differentiates freedom from slavery? It is the principle of voluntary action versus physical coercion or compulsion. Freedom in a political context has only one meaning: the absence of political coercion. Since knowledge, thinking, and rational action are properties of the individual, since the choice to exercise his rational faculty or not depends on the individual, man's survival requires that those who think be free of the interference of those who don't. Since men are neither omniscient nor infallible, they must be free to agree or disagree, to cooperate or to pursue their own independent course, each according to his own rational judgment. Freedom is the fundamental requirement of man's mind. A rational mind does not work under compulsion. It does not subordinate its grasp of reality to anyone's orders, directives, or controls. It does not sacrifice its knowledge, its view of the truth, to anyone's opinions, threats, wishes, plans, or welfare. Such a mind may be hampered by others. It may be silenced, prescribed, imprisoned, or destroyed. It cannot be forced. A gun is not an argument. An example and symbol of this attitude is Galileo. It is from the work and the inviolate integrity of such minds, from the intransigent innovators, that all of mankind's knowledge and achievements have come. It is to such minds that mankind owes its survival. Foggy metaphors, sloppy images, unfocused poetry, and equivocations such as, quote, "a hungry man is not free," unquote, do not alter the fact that only political power is the power of physical coercion. Freedom in a political context means freedom from governmental coercion. It does not mean freedom from the landlord or freedom from the employer or freedom from the laws of nature, which do not provide men with automatic prosperity. It means freedom from the coercive powers of the state and nothing else. The issue is not slavery for a good cause versus slavery for a bad cause. The issue is not dictatorship by a good gang versus dictatorship by a bad gang. The issue is freedom versus dictatorship. A right is a moral principle defining and sanctioning a man's freedom of action in a social context. If one upholds freedom, one must uphold man's individual rights. If one upholds man's individual rights, one must uphold his right to his own life, to his own liberty, to the pursuit of his own happiness, which means one must uphold a political system that guarantees and protects these rights, which means the politico-economic system of capitalism. During the 19th century, man came close to economic freedom for the first and only time in history. Observe the results. Observe also that the degree of a country's freedom from government control was a degree of its progress. America was the freest and achieved the most. Intellectual freedom cannot exist without political freedom. Political freedom cannot exist without economic freedom. A free mind and a free market are corollaries. These two, reason and freedom, are corollaries. Their relationship is reciprocal. When men are rational, freedom wins. When men are free, reason wins. Do not be misled by an old collectivist trick which goes like this. There's no absolute freedom anyway. Since you are not free to murder, society limits your freedom when it does not permit you to kill. Therefore, society holds the right to limit your freedom in any manner it sees fit. Therefore, drop the delusion of freedom. Freedom is whatever society decides it is. It is not society nor any social right that forbids you to kill, but the inalienable individual right of another man to live. This is not a compromise between two rights, but a line of division that preserves both rights untouched. The division is not derived from an edict of society, but from your own inalienable individual right. The definition of this limit is not set arbitrarily by society, but is implicit in the definition of your own right. Within the sphere of your own rights, your freedom is absolute. And that concludes the concept of the day from Ayn Rand, and that's freedom. Back in a minute. Thank you very much. And now the Way to Go President Trump section of my podcast. Today he tweeted, or it may have been 8 hours ago. It says, heading over to Normandy to celebrate some of the bravest that ever lived. We are eternally grateful. D-Day's 75th anniversary. Also, a way to go to the U.S. Secret Service. And they tweeted, as the world remembers all those who served and were lost on D-Day, we were honored to protect the President of the United States and the First Lady of the United States in Normandy, France, for the 75th anniversary of D-Day. Way to go, President Trump. Back in a minute.